It's my honor to chair this session. If we look at the last sessions during last 2 days, unfortunately I found that the last session we just completed, the healthcare industry cooperation, is the only area that China and United States, we don't have vicious competition and confrontation. But in this session, we're going to look at the topic of U.S. China maritime disputes. I don't think China and the United States have maritime disputes if we talk about sovereign dispute over islands and reefs. If we talk about maritime delimitation claims, we don't have such a problem. The only problem between China and the United States related to maritime issues is, from my perspective, freedom of navigation and South-Chinese militarization and maritime dispute settlement approach. So in this session, we have 4 speakers. Let me introduce one by one from my left hand on. But time not allow us to go through details of their academic backgrounds, just look at their current position. The first one is Professor Abraham Sofer. Sofer is working with Georgia Schwartz Senior Fellow in Foreign Policy and National Security Affairs Emeritus Hu institutions. And next to him is Dr. Peng Ni, Research Associate at National Institute for South China Studies, China. And the third one is David Feinstein. David is a founding executive director of China Public Policy Center, the University of Texas at Austin. And then last one, Dr. Hong Long, executive director and senior fellow of Institute for China-American Studies, ICAS. So now I will give the floor to our speakers. Start with Evan. Yeah, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wu. It's been a great privilege to be here today and also to have been brought into the involvement with the Institute and with the Maritime Institute that Dr. Wu directs. This issue of the South China Sea and maritime issues between the U.S. and China is really very delicate, interesting, and difficult. I wanted to say that I thought the last panel was spectacular, and that the overwhelming evidence of cooperation between scientists in our respective countries, the U.S. and China, should not be surprising, and nor should it be surprising that scientists do much better cooperating with each other than politicians. And I want to say that from my own experience in Israel, where I go quite often and did many negotiations when I was in the State Department, in the area of medicine, if you walk into a hospital there, you see Muslims, Jews, and Christians all together being treated exactly alike, with all the doctors being mixed, completely neutral, committed to human health. And outside the doors of the hospitals, you see what you read about in the newspapers. Well, it's sort of, the South China Sea is sort of like the cold water that hits you when you think about the difference between scientists and politicians. The fact of the matter is that it is an extremely difficult issue and one which needs some diplomatic attention. I want to say first that I'm going to restrict my general remarks because I associate myself with what Michael Swain has said, what David Shambaugh has said, and with Dr. Copland's comments in general. Those really important insights about the difference between win-win, which I spoke about three years ago, the first session conducted by the Institute. And I said it was bunk then, and everyone knew it was bunk, but it dominated our rhetoric diplomatically, and I think that was very damaging. But that there's a big difference between win-win when used in general as suggesting that it's a win for America to see China become great, or that it's a win for China to see America stay great, and saying it can be a win-win when two states actually reach agreements, because when they reach agreements on things, generally they do so because they regard it as a win. So those are two very different propositions. Now, the pretense about win-win really came to an end after the Philippines filed suit in 2013 challenging China's maritime claims under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. China refused to participate. It had blocked the Philippines from using areas that the Philippines claimed that were encompassed within China's 9-dash line, even those within the Philippine exclusive economic zone. Negotiations had proved fruitless, and then when the Philippines filed their UNCLOS claim, China refused to appear and took full control of the disputed areas by building some 20 military bases on sites claimed by the Philippines and other states. Now, the U.S. reacted to China's actions like the proverbial preacher who can't practice what he preaches. We reminded China of its obligations under UNCLOS, even though we haven't even ratified UNCLOS. And we also told China to obey what the tribunal had said, even though we do not obey tribunals when they take jurisdiction over cases that we think they don't have jurisdiction over. So U.S. diplomats and military leaders seem to welcome the litigation because it would embarrass China, rather than actively supporting China's position on jurisdiction. They failed to anticipate that China would feel obliged to demonstrate its rejection of the tribunal process, would take full control of the disputed area by force, and would be able to convince a new Philippine government to accept China's de facto control. Well, China, too, in my view, demonstrated a lack of sincerity and mistaken judgment. Its use of power and massive reclamation and building program has costs that I believe are far greater than the benefits. While China may genuinely believe it has sovereignty over all SCS areas within the 9-dash line, few others agree. Anyway, China went far beyond protecting its sovereignty claim. By forcefully engaging in reclamation and building programs, it could have simply disregarded the tribunal's decisions by maintaining control over the area at issue without abandoning its policies of patience and restraint. Its use of force in the South China Sea differs in kind from all China's other international activities. States compete. They take advantage of each other whenever they can, but as China has often insisted, they should use force only when necessary and only proportionately to the threat they face. China has consistently opposed the use of force, but now finds itself in a position where it poses a threat to all of its SCS neighbors. At this point, the relationship between China and the U.S. has deteriorated so seriously that any effort to solve disputes seems to be viewed as hopeless. we have gone full circle from win-win to win-lose. Zero-sum thinking, as though nothing can be done that benefits both states. The U.S. has taken some steps to pressure China to change course in the SCS. It's excluded China from naval exercises, military exchanges, conducted freedom of navigation operations, and it has sought to rally China's neighbors and U.S. allies against China's conduct. But such measures, without diplomatic engagement on this issue, will not cause China to alter its posture. So what can be done? And I am going to put before you some thoughts about a structure within which China might be willing to participate in a reversal of its South China Sea policies without giving up its maritime claims. The possibility exists only because it would be in China's interest to do so. Instead of continuing its policy of preserving its SCS claims, China used force, and it has undermined its claim that it is going to rise to great power status through peaceful invention and energy and effort, rather than through the use of force. This has led China's neighbors to cooperate with each other through mutually shared suspicion and fear. China has also undercut its effort to displace U.S. influence in Southeast Asia. Its SCS actions have forced the U.S. to respond with these FONOPs and other initiatives. And China's SCS neighbors now have good reason to engage with the U.S. on how to curb China's ambitions. The cost of China's SCS actions also include the resources China has spent and must continue to dedicate to military expenditures in the South China Sea at a time China is facing economic pressure domestically and in implementing its other international ambitions. China is undoubtedly aware of these costs. It continues to pursue the code of conduct in ASEAN, and that process is painfully slow, but not moribund, and does indicate that China realizes the importance of that issue to its SCS neighbors. It also knows its SCS actions are inconsistent with its long-espoused commitment to exploit and develop SCS resources jointly with competing SCS claimants. This explains why China has gone out of its way to make agreements with the Philippines, even though it could dictate to the Philippines, both as to resource discovery and as to fishing. So finally, China has also in recent times suggested an international utilization of islands or features in the South China Sea within the disputed area, which indicates that China wants to reach out to the international community on this issue. Now, we should not accept the internationalization, quote unquote, of an area within the SCS that implies that China has uncontested sovereignty over that area. But we should see these offers by China as an opportunity to join China in a constructive move away from unilateral control to a jointly approved non-military use. Such agreements would constitute concrete actions demonstrating China's willingness to return to the policy of cooperating with other claimants in managing contested SCS areas. Now, China should also consider adopting international practices related to navigation and the drawing of baselines within areas that remain contested. Accepting the U.S. position on freedom of navigation, for example, even on a de facto and geographically limited basis, would eliminate the dangers of continued confrontations with the U.S. And other states in these FONOPs, which ultimately will lead to a confrontation that is dangerous between the two states. Now, the international community should support these efforts. Particularly valuable to China, and in this sense, this is the heart of my contribution here, is the idea that the UNCLOS process needs to be revised because the arbitration was clearly intended by China to fall within the reservations of Article 298 of the Convention. Article 298 removed from the jurisdiction of UNCLOS tribunal disputes relating to sea boundary delimitations or those involving historic bays or titles. Despite this plain language, the tribunal decided that it could rule on the legality of China's 9-dash line and many other positions without ruling on such things as boundary determinations and historic bays or titles. The remedy for the disregard of the purpose and meaning of these UNCLOS reservations is, I believe, for the U.S. and like-minded states to join China in confirming that an UNCLOS party's invocation of the reservations of Article 298 are self-defining and unreviewable. Now, this position is consistent with established U.S. policy. The U.S. has repeatedly made clear in presenting UNCLOS to the Senate and in other contexts that were it to ratify UNCLOS, the U.S. would retain the exclusive right, for example, to determine whether its military activities at sea are military activities under Article 298B, which is also a reservation similar to the one that China relied upon. The U.S. supports international adjudication based on consent and has often agreed to resolve its international disputes, even its border disputes, through international tribunals. But the U.S. has consistently opposed the assumption of jurisdiction by international tribunals without adequate proof of consent. The proposed declaration that I put before you would ensure actual consent in all cases. Now, confirming the principle that Article 298 reservations are self-defining would enable China more confidently to return to maintaining its maritime claims without enforcing them. The attorney that convinced the Philippines to sue China, incidentally the same lawyer who convinced Nicaragua to bring suit against the U.S. in the ICJ, is very likely right now trying to convince other SCS claimants also to sue China. Any such suit would only exacerbate the problems created by the Philippine suit. China's use of force in response to Philippine actions indicates it is prepared to use force again to control SCS areas in dispute with other states, some of whom may be more determined than the Philippines to defend their claims, and that could lead to even greater threats to peace. So a declaration by the U.S. and other states that Article 298 is self-defining would provide China a widely supported legal rationale for reversing actions taken in response to the Philippines suit without compromising its claims. So I'm going to summarize the rest of my paper by telling you that, first, that this combination of measures would discourage future conflict in the SCS. The proposed declaration would also serve the interests of China's competing claimants, including the Philippines, because they should welcome China's reversal of SCS actions and a marked reduction in the possibility of future Chinese military action. And it's also mistaken to view self-defining reservations as a setback for international law, because international law depends on the consent of states, not upon determinations that are forced down the throats of states that have actually reserved against tribunal determinations. A proper respect for limitations on adjudication is essential to ensure that states will continue to join treaties that serve the interests of international peace and security. Finally, making the reservations in Article 298 self-defining would enhance the likelihood of confirmation of the ratification by the United States of UNCLOS, because the U.S. failure thus far to ratify UNCLOS is in part based on its distrust of international tribunals' interpretations of Article 298. So, while UNCLOS is written in a manner that seeks to preclude states from being able to prevent adjudication of the scope of the Article 298 reservations, no treaty can, as a practical matter, prevent states in sufficient number from modifying its meaning by ratifying on specified conditions, and amending the treaty in this regard would be a viable option as part of a declaration in the SCS. So with all those thoughts, let me say that the win-win myth is dead in the sense it was used in the past, but a clear-eyed view of conflicting interests does not justify assuming a zero-sum game in which the two states cannot maximize their mutual benefits and minimize their risks. The U.S. should join with China and other like-minded states to initiate the reversal of this extraordinary and, I think, highly destructive use of force in the South China Sea. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Glad to hear you said that China and the United States will work together to promote the amendment of UNCLOS, particularly Article 298. And you also suggested that the United States should ratify UNCLOS. Then we will have this, equal base to discuss the maritime issues. Thank you. Dr. Peng.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for the invitation of the Emory University and ICAS. It's a great pleasure for me to give a talk here. My topic is how to solve the security dilemma between China and the United States in the South China Sea. I attempt to answer three key questions: what the dilemma it is, and how it has formulated or evolved, and how to solve the security dilemma. My argument is that there will be more intense military competition between China and the United States in the South China Sea in the near future. But both sides have to cooperate on managing the risks of the potential conflicts in the region. Security dilemma is a core concept in the IR theory, probably maybe you may know. It means that the state's efforts of strengthening one's military power usually leads to the similar reactions of the other states, the neighboring countries in particular, and thereby causing arms race and even the conflicts in the region. When we take a look in the South China Sea, we can find that both China and the United States are caught into a security dilemma. For instance, the United States wants to prevent China from expanding military presence and even establishing an exclusive leading power in the South China Sea by conducting the frequent FinOps and holding military exercise with allies. While China has also taken a series of countermeasures, such as warning away the U.S. warships illegally entering Chinese waters and enhance its military deployment in the South China Sea. So generally speaking, from my perspective, the security dilemma between China and the US in the South China Sea is jointly determined by the narrowing power gap as well as the rising mutual distrust between the two countries in the region. There is no doubt that the power gap between China and the United States in the Asia Pacific has been narrowed down in the recent years because of the China's rising sea power in the region, as well as the U.S. relatively declining power in the Asia Pacific. The most important consequence of this changing power structure between these two big powers in the region is that the United States, which is in the declining side of the power structure, is increasingly aware of losing its hegemonical leading power in the region, and thereby introducing provocative policies and actions in order to contain China at sea. While China, which is in the rising side of the power structure, has strong momentum to change the status quo, as many American scholars concluded, so as to maintain its sovereignty and protect its national interests. So in the near future, I think that the power gap between these two countries will be further narrowed down, because we can see that China's sea power will still rise. And although the United States proposed the pivot to Asia strategy, as well as the Asia Pacific rebalance strategy, many experts concerned about the U.S. efforts of restoring from the Asia Pacific. So in the near future, the power gap between these two countries have narrowed down, and the United States will take more tough actions to contain China, and China have no choices but to retaliate. The mutual distrust between the China and United States have also sharply increased in recent years. For instance, the United States proposed 3 important government reports and perceived China as a strategic competitor, and this is a huge shift in the U.S. assessment of China, because in the previous U.S. administration, China is perceived as a lizard friend, not the enemy. But now China is definitely as a strategic competitor of the United States. While China also thinks that the United States is the main threat of China's national security. So we can see that there is a growing mutual distrust between these two countries. I can also give you another example about how this mutual distrust is formulated. I noted that the previous speakers mentioned a lot about the distrust. I just mentioned the one theory, it's about the democratic peace theory, 民主和平论. The Western scholars think that the democratic countries would not fight with each other, but the dictatorship or the authoritarian regime will easily fight war. Why? Because they think that the authoritarian regime has little domestic restraints, and they usually don't respect international rules and laws. So they would easily use military force to solve the disputes. So given this, the United States is increasingly worried about the fast-growing Chinese military power in the region. So I think in the near future, the mutual distrust between these two countries will still be enlarged rather than decline. So this will heavily harm the cooperation between these two countries in the South China Sea. So owing to the narrowing power gap, as well as the growing distrust between these two countries in the South China Sea, we will see the more intense military rivalry between these two countries in the South China Sea. So now the problem is that what can we change and what should we do? I think the top priority for both countries is the risk management. Since the previous speakers talk more about the risk management, I would not like to repeat what they have said. I just want to mention the precise policy instruments. For instance, I suggest both countries can establish some trust-building measures, such as the hotlines between the two commanders, as well as establishing the working group between the two navies, such as the Sino-India border, such as the liaison mechanism between the border force of China and India. I think maybe these two countries could construct such a mechanism to exchange information and to avoid misunderstandings and to build the trust. So I think this is urgent duty for the both countries to promote in the near future, because a lot of the scholars are concerned heavily about the possible conflicts between the two warships in the South China Sea. So, in addition, I also propose the two governments to expand the functional cooperation. I would like to emphasize that currently the main concern of the United States maybe the Chinese military deployment in the South China Sea. So the cooperation on the non-traditional issues, security issues, might not be the top priority of the United States governments, and they may have little interest in expanding cooperation with China on such areas. But I still recommend Chinese government to pursue such cooperation with the United States. And I think that this cooperation will lead to the several benefits for both sides. For instance, through this cooperation, both sides could build the initial trust, and they can also accumulate some experience to how to coordinate and cooperation, and pave the way for the future cooperation on some tough issues. And finally, I also suggest that both countries support the academic exchanges between these two countries. I think we hold the 3 days conference in Atlanta. So we shared opinions with a lot of the speakers. We changed opinions, and we learn more from each other. So I think this is a good opportunity for us to increase our understandings and reduce the misunderstandings. So I believe that in the near future we will have the more academic exchanges and to talk more about the South China Sea issue, and talk more, of course, discuss how to promote the cooperation in the South China Sea between these two major sea powers. Hopefully, I finished my presentation within 12 minutes. Thank you. David, looking forward to seeing your perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, and I'm very thankful to all the organizers and sponsors. I will keep my initial round of thanks short so that I can pack a lot into my presentation. I want to talk about 2 topics. One is the issue of the South China Sea, which we've been discussing, and the other is a broader look at what I think are some of these structural issues in U.S. China relations that undergird a lot of the conflicts, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But first of all, let me say a few words about the South China Sea. The South China Sea issue obviously remains a contentious issue between the United States and China. To some degree, it has been displaced a little bit by the trade war, if you will, the trade issues between the two countries, but it continues to pop back into the news in different ways. in terms of ships coming too close to each other, planes coming too close to each other, and other types of dangerous and alarming episodes. A lot has been said and written about the South China Sea. We have some tremendous expertise here on the panel. And so the question I've posed to myself is, what can I say, or what angle can I take on this topic that's a little different than anything that we've done so far in this conference, or that's generally discussed in these types of discussions? The angle that I want to take is to talk about the strategic assumptions that undergird policy and actions on the part of the two countries. We talk a lot about the policies, we talk a lot about tribunal decisions, we talk a lot about military issues, the potential for conflict. What we don't do enough, in my judgment, is talk about the undergirding thinking and assumptions that are going on each side that actually color the thinking and ultimately the actions of the two countries. So what I want to do here is just raise basically 4 questions. And these are questions that I don't seek to answer during this session, because I think to go through even the 4 questions would take a long time. But it'll give you an example of the types of issues that I think are not discussed enough, and where I think conferences like this could focus very fruitfully. So the first question that I ask, and again it goes to the question of assumptions, is the issue of does the United States and does China actually want to solve the issue? Do the two countries actually want to solve this issue? Or, alternatively, is the solution to the issue that could occur within the constraints of reality actually more problematic than the problem? That may sound like an odd question to ask, but as I look at the different factors in the mix in the South China Sea issue and the way that the United States and China relate around this issue, it seems to me that it could very well be argued that both the United States and China, for different reasons, might wish for this conflict or this set of tensions to endure on indefinitely, because this particular situation is better than any alternative situation. And that leads to the second question that I would ask, and that is the present status quo actually a suboptimal status quo, given the constraints, the real-world constraints on all the actors? Or, in fact, is the reason that we have this status quo perhaps precisely because this is the best possible status quo under current circumstances and constraints? So I think we need to think about those questions and discuss those questions in an honest way before we can make judgments about the policies. We have to understand the thinking that goes into those policies. The third question that I would pose is, to what degree do the United States and China's stated doctrines actually reflect the country's real strategic intentions? I think in many cases, both on the Chinese side and on the US side, there are things that we say that are official pronouncements, official policy, but the other side simply doesn't believe us when we say it. For example, China says that the 10,000-foot runway that it's built in the South China Sea is in order to be able to have planes take off and land that are doing meteorological work, humanitarian relief, etc. The United States simply doesn't believe that. Whether that is true or false is in the eyes of the beholder, and the U.S. doesn't buy it. And likewise, China doesn't buy some of the U.S. Stated doctrine either, and equally understandably. So I think we need to ask that question. And the fourth question I would ask, and it leads me to wanting to debunk one particular myth, in my judgment, that it's worth talking about in the context of the South China Sea, and that is, I think it would be good to know, both from the United States and Chinese perspectives, what is the U.S. and Chinese perspective on the likelihood of conflagration in the South China Sea. If there's a sense that there will be conflagration, how will it start? It'd be interesting to know what China thinks and what the United States thinks. And a more specific way of putting that question, what does each country think is the likelihood of the onset of accidental war? And here, let me just offer my particular thought, Some would disagree, I'm sure. But I would like to offer the thought that the notion of accidental war is actually a myth. It doesn't exist. It doesn't ever happen in the world today. The notion that a couple of captains on board a ship in the South China Sea could start World War III is a fallacy. In fact, it's very hard to start a war even when you're trying to do so. I'll give you 5 brief examples because I think this is an important point. North Korea sank a South Korean battleship, no war. Iraq lobbed Scud missiles into Tel Aviv in the first Gulf War, no war. Turkey shot down a Russian military airplane, there was no war. Russia annexed Crimea, there was no war, not a shot was fired. And to take it to the U.S. China relationship, the U.S. sells arms to Taiwan virtually every year. That's an act of war by any definition from a Chinese perspective. There is no war over that. The United States tragically and accidentally bombed the Belgrade embassy in 1999, as was referenced at lunch. No war. And the United States routinely sails military vessels into the what China regards as the territorial waters of China. No war. It's really hard to start a war, and they don't start by accident. So I don't think, in my personal opinion, an opinion that I know some would disagree with, I don't think we have to worry a lot about accidental war in the South China Sea. Let me wrap up this part by just saying a couple of things. I personally think, and I want to commend my fellow panelists, because I think they have some very thoughtful and very valuable ideas for how to move forward, and I am very impressed with the scholarship and with the ideas. But let me offer my brief assessment on this topic before shifting to a few broader points. I think the South China Sea issue will not result in conflagration or conflict that is kinetic or military conflict between the United States and China. I don't see that happening for various reasons. I think it also, however, won't be resolved anytime soon unless people on all sides have the wisdom to listen to Dr. Sofer's and others, and Dr. Peng's and other good ideas. I don't think, through no fault of theirs, because they put great ideas on the table, I don't think that that's going to happen anytime soon, unfortunately. And so I think what we'll see is that the situation will persist in a state of tense stability, a state of tense stability. So that's my assessment there. But let me just shift briefly in kind of the second half of my presentation to make a few broader points about things that actually haven't been discussed at all today or over the last couple of days at the superb conference that many of us have been involved in. And I've been struck by the tremendous caliber and quality of the presentations across the board. But there are a few things we haven't talked about, and I want to raise those here. They're not just about the South China Sea issue, but they relate very directly to that and to others. In my judgment, the South China Sea and other issues on the U.S.-China relationship agenda are actually, in many cases, symptoms of much deeper issues in the relationship. They're issues, they're problems, we talk about them, but they're actually not the core problem. And they're not at the core of where these tensions and mistrust in the United States-China relationship are coming from. So I think there are some structural dynamics in the U.S.-China relationship that you have to understand and that are almost never discussed. And I want to do so briefly here, in order to be able to attempt effectively to get at some of the problems, the symptoms, if you will, that we've been talking about. So let me list what I think are, in my judgment, 7, to some degree, interrelated structural issues or sources of structural tension in the U.S.-China relationship that cause a lot of the problems that we see in many other facets of the relationship. I'll try to be brief because each one of these could be an hour-long presentation. And since I only have 7 hours and not 8, I can't do that. But let me just be brief. The first one, and it hasn't been mentioned here, and it's something that I'm kind of sort of known as the person that comes to China-related or U.S.-China relations conferences, and I'm always the first person to mention God. God. And the point I want to make here is that the United States comes from a Judeo-Christian civilizational tradition. China does not. I say that with obviously absolutely no judgment whatsoever. But there is a very fundamental set of implications that stem from that core difference in our civilizational traditions. And I'll go through those. But the fact that the US is coming at things from a Judeo-Christian civilizational perspective makes our lens on the world and on China very different from China's lens, which comes from a humanistic tradition rooted in, among other things, Confucianism and other indigenous, very profound bodies of thought in China. That's one. One of the things that flows from that is my second point. US foreign policy gives expression to values. Chinese foreign policy does not. And I don't mean that pejoratively. I don't mean that in any way as a negative statement. What I mean is that if you look at what presidents say and what foreign policy doctrines say, the United States is very proud to stand for certain values. But Chinese foreign policy focuses exclusively on one type of thing, and that's procedural principles or process principles. And you can see where the moral dimension of the Judeo-Christian tradition comes through in our emphasis on values. And with equal validity, the humanistic tradition that China has generates a focus on human transactions rather than values. In fact, that was noted by Yao Yao in a very fine presentation yesterday. So it's not that US foreign policy values are different from Chinese foreign policy values. The difference is that US foreign policy espouses values and Chinese foreign policy does not. It's a values-free foreign policy. By the way, no less valid than the US foreign policy, but it's values-free. That's the second point. The third point is that there are competing dualisms, or different dualisms in the United States and China. The dualism of the United States is a dualism of superiority, and it comes from Adam and Eve and the apple and the Bible. It's the idea that there is good in the world and there is evil in the world. That is our dualism. China has a very different dualism, and it leads China to a very different way of thinking about the world. It's the dualism of yin and yang. One side is not better than the other. You need both. They're co-equal. There is value in both sides. One is not morally superior or inferior to the other. This gives rise to China's way of looking at the world, in which China says, and nod your head if you recognize this kind of language, you don't bother me, I won't bother you. You don't tell me what to do, I won't tell you what to do. You don't tell me what kind of system I should have, I won't tell you what kind of system that you should have. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, it does, because China's coming at fundamental international relations issues from a fundamentally different civilizational place. So the dualisms are different. Let me make a couple of other quick points to finish out this list. Number 4 is the issue of symmetry. There's a very basic point that has not been made in these discussions, and that is that the United States is comfortable with asymmetry. We're very comfortable with asymmetry. Where can you trace that back to? Adam and Eve and the apple and the Bible and the notion that there is good and evil. And though we tend to one side, we want to weight the scale on one side. It's not about balance, it's about right or wrong. And so genetically, Americans are comfortable with asymmetry. At a civilizational / genetic level, Chinese civilization and culture is not comfortable with asymmetry. And I would argue that the fundamental dynamic between the United States and China right now is a convergence toward a desire for greater symmetry, but without a huge amount of thought having been invested yet as to what that really will look like. Let me just make one point. One of the things that President Trump said and tapped into as he ran for president, and tapped into it very effectively, was the idea that somehow we in the United States are not being treated fairly by China. And I was explaining that to my friends even in 2015 and 2016 as I was trying to interpret some of these interesting comments that then candidate Donald Trump was making. But it's also true that there is asymmetry in the other direction, and we don't talk about it a lot. So let me be fair, and let me seek the truth from facts. And also note that there's a lot of asymmetry in which the United States does things that we would never tolerate China doing. The fact that we sail military vessels on the high seas in the South China Sea is roughly the equivalent of the idea of China sailing vessels on the waters of the Caribbean Sea, a few miles off of our coast. In rough terms, there's a lot of international water there, and we would never tolerate that. We would also never tolerate the notion of close-in reconnaissance that takes place 12 nautical miles and 6 inches off the coast of the United States coastline. Now, we do it every day, and we expect that to just be accepted. So there is asymmetry on both sides, but that asymmetry is not fully recognized. And I think one of the things that academics and scholars and think tank folks can do is to lay out a list of the asymmetries and to surface those much in the way that you try to surface issues in psychological terms in order to deal with them. Let me also mention one brief aside on the Thucydides trap. I think you asked, sir, about the Thucydides trap earlier. You didn't get an answer, I think, to your question in a very direct sense, so let me give you my personal response to that. The Thucydides trap, in my opinion, is a Thucydides myth. It doesn't exist in the modern world. It hasn't happened, according to scholars of the Thucydides trap, since 1945. Why 1945? Because in 1945, something was invented called nuclear weapons. And I'll put it very simply. If you don't have nuclear weapons, you're not a rising power. And if you do have nuclear weapons, you're not going to go to war. Why? Because of the principle of mutual assured destruction and deterrence. So the notion that somehow the Thucydides trap that applied in 1542 and 1816 is going to apply in 2019, I think, is a fallacy that is not challenged often enough. Let me be very brief and conclude here. A couple of final points. Unipolarity flows out of the asymmetry. One word, I won't dwell on it, one word that's not been mentioned at all in these 3 days, but I'll mention it, and I talk a lot about it, exceptionalism. Relations between countries are complicated when both countries self-define as exceptional, as the United States and China irrefutably both do. And so you've got two exceptional powerhouses, and that's going to create sparks. Finally, rules. It's not just that we disagree on the interpretation of the rules, we often disagree as to whether the refs should be on the referees should be on the field officiating in the first place. We think the rules apply for trade and for UNCLOS, even though we're not a ratified signatory, but we don't think they apply to armed conflict. China thinks they apply to armed conflict. They don't think they apply to UNCLOS, even though they are a ratified signatory, and we just don't agree where the rules apply. Here's a good one-sentence summary. Both the United States and China disregard the rules anytime we think it's convenient to do so, for the most part. The final thing I'll just say is, to conclude, these are difficult issues, and they're reflective of South China Sea and so forth. They're reflective of deeper problems that we don't talk enough about. Under the presidency of President Trump and President Xi, some of these issues have come to the surface to a much greater degree. It means that U.S.-China relations are going to be complicated, but it does not doom U.S.-China relations to failure. I agree with Dr. Peng that what was a large gap in power has been diminishing rapidly, and that's one of the issues that is challenging, because when the gap is great, it's easy to manage these issues. When the gap shrinks, it becomes harder. We need to communicate better. We need to communicate more honestly than we often do. And I agree with President Carter's excellent idea to create an eminent persons group. And finally, we are in a challenging moment, but I still believe that with wisdom, vision, tenacity, and yes, a little help from our better angels, we can realize for our posterity a vision of a U.S.-China relationship that is functional, mutually beneficial, and politically sustainable. Thank you.
No, please.
Thank you, Dr. Wu, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to see that most viewers still awake. allow me to bring your attention for the very boiling hotspot, the South China Sea, to the very high north in the Arctic. The reason I'm giving this talk is the emergence of the Arctic as a region of political economic opportunity does provide a new dimension to add to the existing U.S. China relations in the maritime domain. So the rationale of this talk, after giving you an overview of how the United States and China interact with each other in the Arctic, might bring some implication to managing their differences and divergence in the South China Sea. So I would like to start with giving you an idea of different roles that the United States and China plays in the Arctic. It's very important to define their role before looking at how their behavior in each other, in each regions. So the United States is a very important Arctic littoral state, enjoying a very important seat among the 8 permanent members in the Arctic Council, while China is a non-Arctic state, but also been granted as observer status together with Japan, South Korea, Singapore, India back in 2013. And there are 2 international regimes that governs the Arctic, and both United States and China are signatory to the Suburban Treaty, one signed in 1924, the other signed 1 year after. And the other very important treaty governing the Arctic is the UNCLOS, as was mentioned, while China is a signatory and the United States on its way to ratify the Laos Convention. And then there are 2 internal or domestic policy govern the individual's Arctic policy. For the United States, they have an U.S. Arctic region policy in 2009, and the national strategy for the Arctic regions issued in 2013. And for China, though it was granted as observer in the Arctic Council, and only in January 2018, they issued its first Arctic policy white paper. This is the general framework. So if you look at the U.S. Arctic policy, it's important to understand it actually vision among many of the policy, very importantly for the United States, because it's a littoral state. So meeting the U.S. national security needs priority, and also looking at to protect the Arctic environment, also its living and non-living resources, and then also have interest in maintaining and securing the interest of indigenous people. From Chinese perspective, because it's a non-Arctic state and certainly has interest in, for instance, in shipping through the Arctic, in participating in the management or exploitation of resources in the Arctic, and also have a lot of interest in involving itself in the polar research in the Arctic, and also together with its effort in Antarctic. And it's also very interesting to know that there is a very similar interest for both the United States and China, because both their policy focus a lot on cooperation, but for the United States focus, looking at the cooperation among the Arctic members, the Arctic Council member states, with Canada, with Russia, with Sweden, Iceland. But for China, it's looking at the cooperation from linkage between the non-Arctic state, the one that China is one of, and also with the Arctic member state, the United States one of. I want to talk a little bit about how the United States view China's Arctic policy, which was issued in January 2018. The reason I'm talking about it because when China issued this Arctic policy in January, immediately after that, there was a lot of media coverage about how they view the intention of China's Arctic policy. And I look at how Canada view and how Norway and other Arctic states view the Chinese Arctic policy. It's very interesting to know that some countries are more cautious about China's intention in the Arctic, and some countries are holding a more welcoming posture. For the United States, very interesting to know that it's in the middle way of positive and negative response. So it's difficult to draw on the Trump administration's Arctic policy today. I think it has too many to deal with. It doesn't actually have too much yet to focus on its policy on the Arctic. And there are some concerns that China working too closely with Russia will begin to dominate the Arctic, which is not something the United States want to see. And among many of the American scholars who look at the Chinese Arctic policy, there is a increasing call for continuing the United States leadership role in the Arctic issues. And there was also a call for the United States to strengthen its operational capacity in the Arctic. And some people concerned that the Chinese new Arctic strategy will challenge the U.S. dominance in the high north. And also in following very closely with Chinese Arctic policy, I think there was a lot of discussion among the United States Coast Guard and the call for building more icebreaker in the Arctic, and a lot of attention given to Chinese activity in this region. So to understand how China view how the United States view Chinese activity in this region, it's very important to understand for China and other non-Arctic states like Japan and South Korea, in order to get observer status in the Arctic Council, it's very important that all these non-Arctic states have to adopt the new criteria, which means that all the states they have to respect the sovereignty and sovereign claims, no matter it's for the United States or Canada, Norway. That's the fundamental principle that all these countries, including China, have to respect. That's based on a principle that have to be taken care of. And I want to look at also how China's engagement with the Arctic states compare with its activity or engagement with the United States. So China is very actively engaging, especially on the research perspective, and also for the resource development as well. There's a lot of ongoing, very active engagement between China and the North Arctic, for instance, with Iceland, with Greenland, with Norway, with Russia, with Denmark, with Canada, Sweden, Finland, with the United States. And I think I have to say that the United States always keep a very low profile in its governance in the Arctic. Let me give a few data. So among the Arctic nations, the United States invested very little into its Arctic resources, with no real ports along Alaska, and with very little military presence compared to Russia's military presence. And also there was insufficient domestic engagement. For instance, the Department of State, they has not actually retained an Arctic special envoy or to replace the recently retired Deputy Assistant Secretary in charge of the Bureau of Ocean Environment. There was, compared with other states who have a special envoy or ambassador to the Arctic, I think the United States has not done enough in this line. So if we talk about the U.S. engagement with China in the Arctic, basically we're not talking about the United States as a whole. We're talking about how China engaged with Alaska, because Alaska is actually occupies a very strategic location alongside the Bering Strait, and which provides a very key maritime gateway to the Arctic. In Alaska, you have resources, you have fishery resources, and also have indigenous people's interest there. So let me give a few very brief data on how China engaged with Alaska as a state. China is the largest trade partner and export destination of Alaska since 2011. And Alaska export to China amounts to $1 billion back in 2016. And there are potential for cooperation in energy and mining. And there's a lot of discussion with China's not living resource, especially gas and liquid gas company with the Alaska's companies. Although there's no financial term, but there's a lot of discussion, and MOU has been signed between China and many companies in Alaska. So I would like to add one fact. Although we're having the trade issues, but I think the atmosphere and also environment of talking about cooperation between China and Alaska is still very active. And even with the shutdown of the many governments, I think the Alaska government is not letting the shutdown to get into the way of the Arctic drilling. So there is the Interior Department is moving ahead with oil and gas exploration in the Alaska region in the Arctic. So hopefully we'll get more and more very concrete contract signed and implemented between China and Alaska. I want to finalize my presentation with 2 points. I think China has the potential to be a very strong partner with the United States if it matches its interests with the United States' interests, and also they can work together on many of the issues to adjust that meets both nations' interests. For instance, climate change, there was scientific research cooperation. I think we're missing this cooperation between China and the United States compared with China's efforts with other Arctic states. And also they can have a lot of opportunity to work together to improving infrastructure and the port facilities in the Arctic because they have very similar interests in terms of shipping through the Arctic. Cooperation might be also hopeful also in a sustainable access to energy resources and also indigenous people's interests. So to look at the U.S. China relations in the Arctic, I think we have a lot of convergence between the 2 countries. I just mentioned an Arctic environment and also a science cooperation and shipping, because China and the United States, although they have a different legal protection on freedom navigation in the South China Sea, but in the Arctic they have a similar position because they view, for instance, the Northwest Passage governed by Canada. Canada views it as an internal water, but I think the United States views it international shipping straight for use. I think China will have very similar position with the United States in terms of shipping through the Arctic. And also both countries actually signed the very recently fishery management in the Central Arctic Ocean. Together with other countries, China and the United States agreed not to fish for 60 years in the central area of the Arctic Ocean. I think they do have a lot of foundation and to reach consensus, but there are still divergence. First of all, I think the relationship with China and other Arctic states might be a concern for the United States, particularly with China's increasing engagement with Russia, will create some skepticism for the United States. And also under this general framework of U.S.-China relations in general might also create some difficulty to view the future cooperation between China and the United States in the Arctic. But finally, as I promised in the very beginning, I do want to offer some implication on how the United States and China engage in the Arctic might have implication for the South China Sea. It's very simple how to define your role. If you're a coastal state, your responsibility and then your interests are different. But if you are a stakeholder, not the little state, and then you actually have to play a different role. So it's very important for the 2 countries to recognize each other's sovereignty or sovereign claims in respective regions, and also play a responsible and also cooperative manner in terms of their role as stakeholders. That's all.
Okay, thank you. Since time for this session is almost up, I guess we have a couple of minutes to go, so we still have time for questions. May I give the privileges to our speakers to ask questions each other or offer your comment, if you have, before I open the floor to our audience. No? The audience question? Raise your hands and yeah. Bob? Microphone, Bob. Yeah.
Hello.
Thank you.
I want to thank all of you for this very stimulating and provocative panel. I'm wondering if you all agree with a hypothetical solution or non-solution by doing nothing about global warming, so that one day sea level would solve all the problem at the expense of sacrificing New York City, Shanghai, and possibly Savannah, Georgia. So this is non-starter. Second question is related, I think I want to borrow from David, which is a very stimulating question, also by doing nothing, freeze the status quo, which is perhaps the best option to any alternative, if it's not doable for anything. Now, Do you think that if we should go beyond the South China Sea issue by looking at the broader picture, particularly how the Chinese engage with multiple neighbors and resolving almost all the border disputes over the decades, including Russia, India. India basically has a testing case last year. There is a breaking point, and then both sides backed off. And these are mostly bilateral relations China settled, at certain times sacrificed and giving up its own territory to North Korea, to Burma, and in multiple cases, the Chinese successfully resolve or freeze or shelve those issues. And there are multilateral resolutions like Shanghai Cooperation Organization with the 5 Central Asian states and Russia. So those cases are successful cases. China did manage to prevent the escalation of those crises. And there were wars, there were conflicts, but over time they were all resolved. So South China Sea somehow become an obsession in this country and you know, camouflage of the bigger picture. So I'd like to see if we can learn anything about conflict resolution, prevention, and management. Thank you.
Any more questions?
Well,
Yeah,
I don't, Dr. Wu, could I?
Yeah, just a moment, please.
Well, please, I defer to the speaker who wants to respond to.
Well, I don't agree that tension and stability go well together. I think our experience in life and in politics and international relations all support the proposition, and the history of China's border relationships also supports the proposition that while you might not have a war, an all-out war, say a nuclear attack or something like that, that doesn't define what you're trying to avoid. Lesser attacks can occur and cause terrible disruption, and tension can cause a reduction in engagement, in economic activity, in human exchanges, in medical cooperation. So you have to think constructively about these things and try your best to resolve them. You won't resolve all of them, but I think China's done a marvelous job at resolving its border disputes, its land-based border disputes. And I think China feels very awkward about its current situation in the South China Sea because nobody trusts China in the region. They are worried about China taking similar action against them, the other claimants. So this is an unstable situation because it is so tense, and I think it should be addressed.
I would just say 2 things very briefly. One is, I think what Churchill said about democracy perhaps can be said about the situation in the South China Sea. The status quo is the worst that it could possibly be, except for every other possible alternative. And in real terms, in terms of the real constraints, no one is going to give away sovereignty in the foreseeable future, and yet no one is going to want to fight a war, a full-fledged war, which is why the situation has endured in kind of a tense stability for several decades, including in recent years. The other point I would make is that the United States and the USSR lived in a world of tense stability for 70 years, and barely a shot, if any, was ever fired. It can endure for a long time until situations change, the world changes, and so on. And likewise, a current example of, if you will, this notion of tense stability is the whole situation around Taiwan. Now that's a separate discussion, but what can't be argued is that over the last 70 years, the situation has remained generally, or at least let's say the last, 40 years since normalization, the switching of diplomatic relations, the situation has remained more or less recognizable over a long period of time, and yet it wouldn't be possible to say that it's not a tense situation. So I think that tension can last a long time without necessarily exploding into conflagration. I'm not saying that's the desired outcome, but it certainly is something that we've seen many times over the years with powers that have 10,000 nuclear weapons each.
Okay, thank you. Last question.
At the risk of a rather crude cynicism, and perhaps Judge Sofair would disagree with me, my experience in Washington, D.C. was that in some cases resolved questions are a recipe for unemployment, and that the permanent maintenance of unresolved questions is what half of the city depends on to make its living. And I wonder whether in some cases unresolved questions internationally develop their own constituencies, which who define themselves and their reasons for being or their budgets around the permanence of those unresolved questions. And in that sense, they take on a life of their own, which, unless somebody does something really stupid, can go on for a very long time. But I do have one final, very naive question and one more little observation. The naive question is, why doesn't China just invite the world, including the United States, to sail wherever they want, as long as they stay 12 miles offshore? It implicitly says there are waters, we've already claimed them, it's our sovereignty, you're welcome to go anywhere you want. Sail your destroyers up and down, fine. Take a cruiser, take an air, doesn't matter, it's our waters. But, so that's my naive question. My other concern, though, is that when we talk about opening the Arctic to the kind of shipping that China and the United States conducts, I mean, I live on the edge of Puget Sound. I live where all the ships coming from Asia go right by my house on the way into Puget Sound. It is a vast traffic. It may be added to by Canadian coal shipments in the very near future. As we look at the Arctic, how are the great shipping powers of the world going to deal with the fact that one single oil spill, one single naval accident up there can do just unthinkable environmental damage? And what is being done between the United States and China, or on a more global basis, to deal with that obvious challenge which exists under very inhospitable conditions? The Arctic is not the Gulf of Mexico, for example. Thank you.
Okay. Who would take about this question? You? Okay, I'll respond to the first question proposed by Professor, I don't know your name, sir. So since you mentioned India, I guess maybe you mentioned the military standoff between the border forces of China and India in the Dockland maybe in 2017. Yeah. So first of all, I think that it is totally different because there is no territory dispute between China and the United States, but between China and India there is a territory disputes. But I still think that we can find some useful experience to manage the risks. As I mentioned in my presentation, I suggest that both countries can build some like the working group between the border forces. So why the China and India closed the military standoff in the Dockland? I think the most important reason is that there is a mechanism between these two border forces, and it can prevent them from escalating the conflicts. This is the first reason. The second reason is that there is an agreement on politically solving the border dispute between the two governments. So I think if we can draw some experience from the China-India border issue to the Southeast Asia, the first is the mechanism. The second is we may reach some agreement on peacefully coexistence in the South China Sea or some, on some other kind of. I think maybe this is a possible way for us to push forward in the near future. That's all. Thanks. Thank you. Hold on.
Yeah, very quickly respond to Dr. Cobbs. Your question is not naive at all. If inviting the shipping to sail through the China Sea and other less sensitive times is certainly possible, but right now, with the hostile environment in the South China Sea, any shipping or navigation in this region with the help of freedom navigation actually adding a lot of political agenda to the existing legal regimes. So that's the issue. And also, I really like your point about the future potential risk to the environment if sailing through the Arctic. And you are very right. A lot of countries like China, South Korea, and Japan, whose economy depend a lot on international trade, shipping trade, they have a lot of enthusiasms in shipping through the Arctic. But if you talk to other little states like Canada, they will tell you that they're not ready in terms, for instance, search and rescue efforts. And you might experience, because harsh weather, very technical issues, and any potential risks associated with shipping through the Arctic, and they are not actually ready for that. I think that is where exactly the area that non-Arctic states, including China, can actually cooperate with the littoral state to make it like a common agenda to address the potential environmental problem, such as the oil spill, as we just mentioned.
Okay, thank you. Time is up for this session. Before I conclude this session, please join me in giving thanks to our speakers. Thank you.